gives us. Strategy, I'm thinking of primarily in terms of, and leadership. That strategy is the ability to see far, to gauge the entire social field, to make long-term plans about the totality of the operation or the enterprise. Tactics instead, which has traditionally been the responsibility of followers, not leaders, has to do with specific interests and short-term grassroots goals or rank and file operations. So that traditional division has been based on capabilities, with the idea that only leaders have the ability, only the few leaders have the ability for strategy. Like I said, for being able to see the entire field, because most people's vision is limited, something like that. Whereas, like I say, that because they don't have that ability, most people are not in position to really have a say in strategy. So our question is, what if these capacities, the capacities necessary for strategy, were becoming generalized? What if democratic movements were able to make effective decisions and long-term plans? And that's what we mean by the inversion. It's not the elimination of leadership, but a reversal of roles, so that the movements were capable of strategy, and leadership was limited to tactics. So that latter part, tactical leadership, maybe it's not that hard to understand, actually, what that would mean. It would mean that there are some responsibilities that require either special expertise or swift response, technical knowledge is something like that. But these would be short-term actions for specific purposes, which are then dispersed. So deployed for when necessary and then dispersed. That's the idea of this tactical leadership. Now, many of my friends say to me when I've proposed things like this, Mike, you're playing with fire. You give them any power, they'll never give it up, something like that. Like you can't count on the idea of a short-term or limited form of leadership. It seems to me that that's not really the problem. The problem is really on the other side, because if you could guarantee, and this is what I mostly want to talk about, a multitude capable of strategy, then the restriction of leadership to tactical questions would be in some ways guaranteed. So the strategic movements, how can we identify, this is the question for that, how can we identify people's existing capacities for strategy, strategic political decision making, and how can we develop those capacities in the future? I guess what I'm mostly going to be insisting on is ways in which those capacities are already here. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could give an example of the traditional strategy and tactics in a mass movement.
Yeah.
And also now one that illustrates the inversion.
I'll give you in a second. Let me just wait a second for those two, because I think I can do both of them. I just want to say that I'm going to go on in a minute to try to insist on the existing capacities people have for decision making in movements, and that's mostly what I'm really going to focus on. But for that, I thought there's one principle before starting off down that line, which is about spontaneity. Like the principle is something like this: never trust anyone who calls a movement spontaneous. Like it's sure to be a mystification. There are a bazillion classic examples. The one that I was thinking of first when Tony and I were talking about this was about the 1960 Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins. Those sit-ins, by many allies and certainly journalists, were called spontaneous. Of the young black men who sit at the white lunch counter. Everyone knows the 1960 Greensboro sit-in. So it's called spontaneous, but that really, it's only from the outside that something like that looks spontaneous. From the inside, one has to recognize all of the organization that was already going on within student groups in Greensboro, within the local NAACP. Also the strategy for over a year before that of sit-ins throughout the Southeast. So that it only looks like something that comes out of nowhere if you haven't been inside the thing. That's what I'm trying to say, that there's a lot of times where we don't recognize people's organizing capacities and the things that are already going on just because we're too external to them, and often get called spontaneous. So yeah, so one direction you could go, and so I'll give you the things that you were just asking about. One direction one could go is to talk about specific examples and use this notion of an inversion of strategy and tactics as a kind of yardstick to evaluate them. And the kind of contemporary political formations I had in mind about this, like for instance, I would say the movement for Black Lives, or the platform associated with the post-Brexit movement for Black Lives, that might be one good example. For me, I had thought, or I've much more developed something to say about Podemos, the national party in Spain, or the municipal government in Barcelona and in Madrid too, which those two are, coming to power on the backs of social movements, and in some ways trying to suggest that the movements are still in power behind someone might make this argument about the Bernie campaign. Like, I would be interested in that. I'm not in the position yet